Hi, this is Mike Shipman, Blue Planet Photography, and I'm going to give you a class today called Before You Buy, which is about selecting a camera or upgrading your camera. And first, I'll introduce myself a little bit. I've been photographing professionally full-time since 2004. And my background is as a wildlife biologist, so I haven't been photographing professionally my whole entire career, but I've been photographing for many years since I was young. Photography was the first art form that I started learning when I was little. So anyway, we can go on to the samples. So here are some examples of my work. I'm mostly photographing nature and motorsports and environmental. I do a little bit of commercial and editorial work, as well as fine art. And then I teach. I've been teaching since 1998 and teach a broad range of classes from very beginner to advanced and Photoshop. Okay, so we'll get on with this class called Before You Buy. And cameras come in a dizzying array. You'll want to slow that. Yeah, go back just a little bit. So cameras come in a dizzying array of sizes, formats, sensors, and capabilities in two different formats, film and digital. Most photographers these days are shooting with digital cameras. One way to choose a camera is to go to your local camera store, if there's still one left in your area. And here you'll be assisted by a salesperson who may or may not have your best interests at heart. Will that salesperson ask you the necessary questions to narrow down the list of the best cameras for your purpose? Or does the store need to offload some excess equipment or stuff that's not selling or near obsolete inventory? Does that salesperson need to boost their commission this pay period? And does the store cater to a favorite brand? Does the store even have the inventory to show you the models you might be interested in and what they may want to sell you so you can test how it fits in your hand? Is the salesperson knowledgeable? Most dedicated camera stores have staff who are skilled and knowledgeable in photography and equipment, but big box stores with a camera department maybe not so reliable or only carry the most popular consumer gear. Another option, and the more common one, is to purchase your camera online. Here you have no salesperson to guide you, but you must also rely on your own knowledge and research. Dry specification sheets and unqualified opinionated customer reviews and/or review sites. Now, those review sites can be useful, can be helpful to narrow down a selection, but they're usually incomplete and they're only based on individual person's personal preferences or their way of using a camera. And so you're going to get a lot of pointed, one-sided arguments, or not arguments, but tips and reviews that may not be useful for what you're looking for. And there's no option available to hold the camera in your hand, again, to see if it fits and how it feels. But having some knowledge of what's out there and what camera features and functionality you're needing will help you navigate the sales pitch. So if you do go to a camera store, you have some knowledge that you can tell the salesperson exactly what you want or pretty close what you want, and they can just help you kind of weed out the models that aren't applicable. And if they're trying to sell you something that you don't need, you can identify that too. In my in-person class, we can tailor the information to your specific needs, but in this session, I'll have to cover some wider ground just to be more general. So there's a lot of information here that might not specifically apply to you, but it may apply to somebody. So in this session, I'll cover the 3 different categories of camera equipment: consumer, prosumer, and pro, and the difference cameras in each category are likely to have. I'll list some things to consider, questions to ask yourself when looking for a new camera or an upgrade. I'll talk a bit about sensors and megapixels, point out some camera features you might find useful now or in the near future, and at the end, talk a little bit about accessories like tripods, camera bags, and other modifiers, computers, printers, and imaging processing applications. A key thing to remember, though, is that the camera is just a tool to help you achieve the photographs you intend to make. The features and functionality are meant to assist you, not do all the work for you, whether it's your family's activities or vacation photos, for prints for a camera club competition, or to hang on a wall, or for professional use like architecture or weddings. With whatever information you have, choose a camera that'll meet your specific needs today and for potential future needs. Okay. So here's a slide of the various formats, various footprints of cameras, and there's a wide variety out there to choose from. Okay. So the 3 categories that I mentioned before: consumer, prosumer, and pro. And these have each camera sort of class in each of these groups have different features, different price points, and different sort of purposes. Like I said, the camera's a tool, and so each of these groups are cameras that are tools for a particular range of uses or a particular function. So the first category is the consumer class. This is primarily for the hobbyist or the amateur, the family snapshots, those kinds of things. They're convenient. They're compact, they're small. Some you can put in your pocket or in a book bag or something and carry it around with you pretty easily. They are integrated, so it has a built-in lens so that you don't have extra equipment floating around. They're lightweight, so they're easy to carry for if you're going on a hike or things like that. They're generally the least expensive. They're mostly automatic operations, so there's not usually manual settings or a lot of customization that's available on these brands of cameras or these types of cameras. They're less durable. The materials that they're made of are usually, they're disposable for the most part. So if you drop it, it's likely to break. The lens quality, the sensor quality are usually fairly low or lower, and so museum quality prints or commercial quality prints or things like that aren't really that usable off of these cameras. They shoot with a JPEG file format rather than RAW. There are some consumer-grade cameras that do have RAW capability. I should mention on here, too, that the sensor size is usually fairly small. The resolution, the number of megapixels are usually fairly small as well. Consumer cameras usually run in the $300 to $900 range. Now, also, these categories they don't have rigid boundaries, so there is going to be some overlap between them. Some of the consumer class cameras kind of bleed over into the prosumers, and prosumers bleed over into the pro categories. So I'm just categorizing these for simplicity, more or less. So the prosumer cameras are intermediate, amateur, or beginning pro type cameras. They're also convenient. They're compact. Some of them can be compact and also integrated. Some also have interchangeable lens capabilities. The lenses on the prosumer cameras are usually better quality. Sometimes in the consumer class category, the lenses are made of plastic. Prosumer, you'll see a lot more glass as lens components. The prosumer camera has a higher cost. They have more manual functions typically, maybe some customization capabilities as well, so you can set particular settings that you use on a regular basis for specific kinds of things like sports or landscapes, or if you do product photography, that kind of thing. They're not typically, but there are metal-bodied cameras that are in the prosumer class. ABS plastic for bodies, which is pretty durable and long-lasting. There's more functionality, so we go back to the manual functions, the customization possibilities. There might be some ports on there for adding microphones for video, or for adding a PC cord for flash setup, or there might be a hot shoe flash on the camera, built-in flash that has some adjustability. So a lot more range of things that you can do with a prosumer camera than you can with the strictly consumer brand or consumer class. Higher quality, better sensors, better image processing in the camera as far as the JPEG image goes. If you want to do any image processing, black and white, sepia toned, or other special effects, can sometimes be done on a prosumer camera, but not so much on the consumer side. And those prosumer cameras could run in between $800 and $1,700 as a general range. The next class is Pro. The Pro class is, I call it Pro just because it kind of designates a certain type of photographer. It doesn't mean that these are for professionals only. But they have more complex operation. There are a lot more functions than the other two classes. There is usually sometimes a video out port, so you can tether your camera if you're doing portraits, things like that in the studio for studio work. You can tether your camera to a monitor so you can see what the camera sees. Sometimes there's a remote operation, so you can put your camera on a tripod and operate it remotely, either through an application on a phone or through a cabled control, or even through wireless on a laptop or a desktop computer. Pro categories have the most flexible equipment selection in terms of like lenses and flash and other things that attach or can be used with the camera, video and audio, those kinds of things. Pro category cameras have the highest cost. They're usually larger. They have a bigger footprint. They're heavier. They take up a little bit more room in your camera bag than the other two types of cameras. They're the most durable, often with metal bodies, weather sealing around the doors and the ports and the lens mount. Helps keep water and dust out. And the higher quality with sensors, lenses, the glass, the image processing inside the camera, the speed of the processing of the image from the camera to the memory card, autofocus, accuracy, and speed, different metering modes, light metering modes, just other functions that give you more capability than a consumer brand camera or a consumer category camera. And so the Pro cameras usually start around 1,500 and go to 6,000 or more, depending on the brand and what you need on that particular camera. Okay, within the camera there is the digital sensor, and different brands of camera, the different models have different size sensors, and the sensor has some effect on the image quality, the image size, as far as being able to do enlargements, not really enlargements, but as far as particularly things like depth of field. And I'll go through that here in just a second. So just to run down the different sensor sizes, the first one is full size. This is equivalent to 35 millimeter film. It's a 3:2 ratio, roughly 36 millimeters by 24 millimeters. It varies a little bit between brands. It has a 1-to-1 crop factor, so it has no magnification effect at all, using the lenses that were made for full frame cameras, either film or digital. The next one is APS-C. This is a smaller sensor size. It's in most of the 35 millimeter DSLR cameras. It's also a 3:2 ratio, 25 millimeters by 17 millimeters roughly. Because of the smaller sensor size, it has what's called a crop factor or a magnification effect when you're using a full frame lens, or a lens that's made for a full frame camera. These days, a lot of the manufacturers have also developed lenses that are specifically made for cameras with APS-C sensors, and that means that like the Canon EFS type lenses, and what that does is that it puts the rear of the lens closer to the sensor. The lens creates what's called a circle of coverage, the coverage area, and that circle covers the edges of the rectangle of the sensor, just like it would the rectangle of film. And the full frame sensor covers too much of the APS-C size area of the sensor. So what's on the sensor is magnified, has a magnification effect of 1.6. So if you have a full frame lens, like a 50 millimeter lens, and you have that on a camera that has a smaller APS-C sensor, you multiply that focal length by 1.6. So that's, I can't do that in my head right now. The 1.6 times 50 is about roughly 80 millimeters. But the camera manufacturers, after digital became more popular, developed lenses that specifically were for the APS-C sensors, so that you didn't have to do that mental calculation. And the difference is that they made the rear element on that lens shorter, so that it could be, longer, so that it could be closer to the sensor and fill the sensor with that image circle. Now you can't use an APS-C lens on a full frame camera. At least most of them. I think Nikon has the capability to use either, but mostly because on a digital SLR, inside the camera there's a mirror that flips up when you release the shutter. And with the APS lens on a full frame camera, that rear element sticks far enough into the camera that when the mirror comes up, it hits the back of the lens. And that can cause some problems. First of all, you don't get a full image or any image at all, and it can damage the fragile mirror apparatus. So if you're thinking of upgrading a camera, if you have right now an APS camera and you want to go to a full frame camera, you would have to take into consideration that you'll probably have to, or likely have to, also purchase new lenses. The next one is 4/3. This is the size that's predominantly in the mirrorless cameras. It's a 4:3 ratio, which is similar to the old television ratio, almost square. It has a 2 times crop factor with full frame lenses. And this crop factor is almost not something to even consider these days because of the proliferation of the digital lenses that are built for that sensor size. Now, mirrorless cameras can have an APS-C or a full-size sensor in them as well. Compact cameras, the smaller, like point-and-shoot type cameras, have a 7.5 by 6 millimeter sensor. And iPhones or smartphones are around 5 millimeters by 3.5 millimeters. And that's really, really small. That's smaller than your fingernail on your pinky finger. So that's why phone photos can't be enlarged more than maybe 5 by 7 or 8 by 10. I've made 10 by 10 photos from an iPhone, and the newer iPhones have 20 megapixels now. So you could probably get maybe an 8 by 12, possibly an 11 by 14 out of an iPhone image. I haven't tried it yet. But at that size, the images start to fall apart. They get pixelated and they lose their resolution. So full size or APS-C sensors are going to be the more common. Okay, so some question. Oh, the next slide is an example, kind of a visual example of what those sensors look like relative to one another. So on the left top is a full frame. ASP or APC-H is the not used anymore. It was briefly used in Nikon cameras and a couple of Canon cameras, but they all went to the ASPC size because they're less expensive to make, and they can make a smaller form factor camera as a result of the smaller size. And then the 4/3 down there at the bottom, the 4:3 ratio. And you can see down on the lower right, the smartphone sensor relative to any of those, they're really, really tiny. Okay, so there are some questions to go through as far as what you're going to select or how you're going to select your camera. And the first one is kind of obvious. What are you likely to be photographing most often? Now, a lot of cameras are generalists. You know, their functionality is covers a lot of different uses. So you can shoot sports and action to some extent, landscape, travel, portraits, long exposures, those kinds of things. But when you get into some of the more demanding subjects like sports or portraits or weddings, things like that, or if you want to get into video, then that kind of narrows down your list of cameras to choose from. The second question is, are you looking for flexibility or portability? So flexibility is what you can do with the camera. If you shoot landscapes, kind of like me, if you shoot landscapes and action and fine art and products and portraits and things like that, then you want a camera that's going to be more flexible, and that may not be portable or as portable, say as a smaller compact camera that'll fit into your pocket or a book bag or something very easily. If you're shooting a lot in the studio, then portability is not going to be a big issue. If you do a lot of travel photography and you're going through airports, things like that, or you're hiking a lot, then portability becomes important, because you don't want to carry 30 pounds of camera gear. You might just want to carry a couple pounds. And if you're traveling a lot, you might not want to be as conspicuous with a big camera setup. A lot of people that have larger cameras, larger lenses, they get looked at as professional. It's just kind of a stigma with those kinds of cameras. And so you get a lot more attention than you would if you have a smaller camera that just fits in your hand. Okay, and question 3 is along those same lines: how much gear are you willing to carry? And these are some ideas or some concepts for these different types of photography. So with astrophotography, definitely need a tripod for stability for these long exposures that you're going to be making. A tracking motor if you're going to be tracking stars or tracking planets, or nebula if you're going to be attaching your camera to a telescope, those kinds of things. You'll need to have a tracking motor so that you don't end up with blurry images. Cable release to limit camera movement. Definitely a high quality lens. Low noise ISO, which is the sensitivity. The ISO is a sensitivity setting. And at higher ISOs, the lower priced cameras, the ISOs, the image starts to fall apart very quickly when you get above, say, 400 or 800 ISO. And so if you're shooting at 2200 or 22,000 ISO, your image is going to be very blocky and very low resolution. And then full frame. For portraits and weddings, there are a lot of different situations that you'll run into with portraits and weddings. You'll be doing close-ups and candids, and you'll be doing large groups, and so you'll want a range of focal lengths. Again, quality ISO, because you want your pictures to be sharp and high resolution. Portability, here and there. If you have somebody assisting you that can carry a bunch of your gear, then you can be as portable or as loaded up as you need to. But generally, weddings are sort of like sporting events, and so you got to be moving around a lot and switching lenses and switching cameras sometimes, and having that portability makes it easier for you as well. Convenient operation, you want to be able to get to the common functions on the camera that you use a lot. Things like, maybe a back button focus, or changing white balance, or changing autofocus points, your focus points, changing lenses, changing ISO, changing shutter speeds, those kinds of things, color balance, all those are, I said white balance, but white balance, some cameras are not as convenient to use in that regard. Some of the cameras, mirrorless, it's getting better, but some of the mirrorless cameras and some of the compact cameras and even prosumer have what's called shutter lag, where there's a delay between the time that you press the shutter release and the time that the the shutter opens. And that can be fairly frustrating. It can be as long as a half a second in some of the least expensive cameras. And even a tenth of a second is fairly long when it comes to shooting action or something that's moving. To have a dual memory card slots is really useful, so that you can either create in-camera backups where when you make the photograph, you make the exposure, the camera writes the same image to two cards at the same time, so you have one backup or two backups or two images, or you can use the second card as an overflow. So if you run out of space on one card, it automatically switches over to the second card, so then you don't have to worry about running out of room. The back button focus is a function of some of the more advanced cameras, and what that does is it separates out the shutter release and the focus from the same button. So typically the trigger, the shutter release button, when you press it halfway down, it activates the light meter and the focus. And then when you press it the rest of the way, it releases the shutter to make the exposure. The back button focus separates out the focus part, because there's a little bit of a delay between the time that you're pressing the shutter halfway down and you press it all the way down. There's a little bit of a delay between that action. So if you're photographing a moving subject, like you photograph a sporting event or a wedding or something where there's a lot of activity going on, by the time you press the shutter release all the way down and take that picture, your subject may move just enough to be out of focus. It also works fairly well when you're shooting portraits. If you're hand holding in a portrait session, if you're not extremely steady in your camera handling, you can lean forward or backwards between the time that you press the shutter release halfway and focus and the time that you press it all the way and take the picture, and that could cause your subject to be out of focus. It's the difference between having eyes in focus and eyes out of focus. But the back button focus, if you have your camera set to autofocus tracking, while you have that button pressed, the camera will continually focus. Then when you press the shutter release button, the delay is minimal to non-existent, so that your image is in focus when you take the picture. So if you do the autofocus tracking with the shutter release button, between the time that you press the button halfway and start focusing, the focus or the camera will track. And then when you press it all the way down, that focus tracking stops to release the shutter. So you still have a delay there between the autofocus tracking and the shutter release. So the back button focus is a really handy thing to have. It takes a little bit of practice to get used to it, because everybody's forever and ever has been used to the single button shutter release. But it does work out really well when you get used to it. The full frame sensor, also what it does is the full frame has a shallower depth of field. There's some technical aspects to that. I won't go into it in this session, but if you want a shallow depth of field for a portrait to blur a background or to create a shallow depth of field in a landscape or in a product shot or something like that, the full frame sensor is going to be the best option for that. The APS-C, the smaller sensor, the shallower or the depth of field is deeper, and it takes a lot more effort to create that shallow depth of field look with a smaller sensor than it does for a full frame sensor. The next would be continuous shooting, or still, yeah. So on the continuous shooting, the number of frames per second, so when you press the shutter release down, as long as you hold that shutter button down, the camera will shoot. And typically, like a prosumer camera, if it has a continuous shooting mode, that mode is usually somewhere between 3 and 5 frames per second. It's usually either 3 or 5 frames per second. And that's fast, but you could press the shutter release manually that many times in a second. For sports or something that's moving, an action type of a situation, that may just barely be adequate. So if you're shooting something that's like a portrait or a wedding where things are moving around, people are moving around, and you want to make sure that you get the shot, if you could get a camera that has more than 5 frames per second continuous shooting, that could save you some heartache, or if you're shooting sports or something like that. Also for portraits or weddings, particularly weddings, you need to have a good quality high ISO setting or quality, so that when you're shooting inside in a low lit situation, that you're able to use a high ISO and still get a usable photo. And then video 1080p or 4K, high quality, 16:9 ratio, widescreen. A lot of weddings and not so much portraits, but weddings are demanding more video these days. So a camera that has fast frames per second, high quality ISO, and video would be good for portraits. Sports and action, pretty much the same. You want maybe a camera that does 10 frames per second or faster. There you're going to get into more of the pro type camera, the higher expensive, higher cost camera. You want it to be rugged. So if you drop it or bang it into something, it's not going to adversely affect the operation of the camera. You want it to be weather sealed, so that if you're out in the rain, that if it starts to rain while you're out shooting, you don't really have to worry too much about the camera just dying. The prosumer and consumer cameras are not weather sealed, so if you're out in a light rain, or if it's misty and foggy, any water that gets into the camera could cause it to short out and not work. APS-C sensor gives you that extra reach, that 1.6 crop if you're using a full frame lens, so that can save some money. If the difference between a 300 millimeter lens and a 600 millimeter lens is roughly about $2,000. So you could save a little bit of money there by using a smaller sensor, and the lenses are a lot less heavy. Back button focus, multi-group focus point selection. So if you're photographing something that's moving, instead of a single focus point, you can use a group, like a group of 4 or 5 or 9 focus points that allow you to be more likely to get your subject in focus than trying to put a single dot on a moving object. It's a little easier to target. Okay, next one. Landscape and nature. Again, a tripod, range of focal lengths, wide angle to telephoto, cable remote for long exposures, also rugged, weather sealed. The 100% viewfinder, what that means is that some cameras, most cameras I should say, when you look through the viewfinder, it doesn't show you the whole picture. It doesn't show you everything that it's going to record as the image. So there's a little bit of an edge. It could be anywhere from 90 to 95% coverage. So you have anywhere from 5 to 10% of the image outside of your field of view when you're looking through the viewfinder. And that could, a lot of times what that does is what happens there is that when you get the picture back or when you look at it on the screen, there's something sticking in the edge of the frame that you didn't see through the viewfinder, but the camera was able to capture because you didn't see it, but the camera did. So 100% viewfinder gives you 100% coverage. So what you see in the viewfinder is what you see in the final image. For vacation, travel, hiking, and we kind of mentioned that before at the beginning, small and lightweight, integrated. So do you have the lens integrated with the body and a lens that has a wide angle to telephoto capabilities so that you don't have to change lenses, but you have a lot of capability while you're walking around where you can zoom into things and you can zoom out to get wide angle as well. Plus, it's more inconspicuous than carrying a big camera bag with a big camera and a lot of lenses and tripod and all that stuff. It makes it easier to move around if you're in a crowd or if you're go into a museum or someplace like that where they don't let those big cameras and tripods come in. You can make it in there with your smaller compact camera. Okay, question number 4. I'll go back just a little briefly to the number 3 is about how much gear you're willing to carry. So these lists all list out not all the gear that you would use for these kinds of this type of photography, but how much are you willing to carry when you go out to photograph? Sometimes you can carry it in your car. Like I carry a lot of camera gear in my car when I go driving around looking for stuff, and I can just shoot from the car. And if I have to walk a little bit, I can just take what I need and then just come back to the car. But if I'm on a long hike or something like that, I'll just take a small amount of gear, basically what I need for that trip. If I'm doing a wedding or something like that, then I have to be more selective about what I take. What can I use? What can I get to? How easy can I change out gear quickly to meet a quickly moving scenario situation? So each of these types of photography, they don't require all this gear, but there's an idea to kind of give you what kinds of things to expect if that's the kind of photography you're interested in doing. Okay, so number 4 is what's your budget? And we've talked a little bit about cost and repeat the different category of cameras and their kind of basic range. The consumer level camera usually comes, if it's integrated, it'll have a lens built in. The prosumer can also have an integrated body, compact body, and it can also be an interchangeable lens camera. And the pro level typically are all interchangeable lenses. So those prices are actually for the body of the camera. Now, on the consumer, like I said, the consumer includes the lens and everything like that. But the prosumer and the pro cameras, those prices are typically just for the body. The lenses are extra. So going into those classes, that upgrade of camera, you'd also have to consider the cost of the lenses, which can range pretty widely. And there's also a kind of a consumer, prosumer, pro level category of lenses as well. And those also correspond to things like durability and quality in terms of how much how good the glass is in the lens, how much care they put into the coatings on the lens, the grinding of the glass to make the image sharp, to accommodate for separation of the color spectrum, There's a lot of sort of technical stuff that's involved there, but you pay for that higher quality, and sometimes quite a bit. So if you're looking for high quality images, you're looking at it for high quality capabilities, you might have to spend some extra money for those higher quality lenses. And then other accessories would be like camera bags, tripod, flash, studio flash, on-camera flash, memory cards, and then plus once you get your digital images in the camera, what are you going to do with them? So if you'll have to look for a computer and software to process those images, to enlarge them or crop them or composite them. Hard drives for storage, or online strategies or online places for storage and backup, because it's very easy for digital files to go away forever, and it's easy to delete them. It's easy for the hard drive to fail, computers, motherboards to fail or short out, energy spikes coming into your camera that can just completely fry everything. So if you don't have a backup of those digital files somewhere, you can lose them. Now there are ways that you can recover digital files and broken hard drives, but it can get really expensive. I've had a couple of hard drives fail on me before I had backups made, and both times to recover cost me $300 each to have that hard drive backed up. Now, I did have another hard drive that failed, that was a mechanical failure, and it cost me $1,200 to have that recovered. And sometimes, most of the time, they can get all the data off that drive, but sometimes they can't. So you get some back, or you'll get it all back, and some of it will be corrupted, and you won't be able to read it, or it'll be messed up that you can't print it. So always be careful with your backups. And then printers, if you print your work, ink, paper, all that stuff. So a digital camera is not just a digital camera. It's tied into a whole system of accessories and other equipment that has to be accounted for in your budget. All right, so number 5 is, what are your goals? Now these are all kind of related. How much are you going to carry? How much money do you have? How much is in your budget? What do you intend to do? What's your favorite kinds of, what are you going to be focusing on most? What are you going to be photographing most? And so with your goals, look into the future. What features are you needing or would you like to have? Sensor size, lens selection, ISO range and quality, the continuous shooting speed, the cable remote. Now some cameras, even some prosumer and pro class cameras, you can get a remote, but it's an infrared remote or a wireless remote, and there isn't a capability to add a cable remote. Now the downside to the wireless remote is that it operates off of infrared, and if you're not too far away, it's good for selfies and that kind of thing, or if you're doing a portrait with a group and you're not very far away from the camera, that works fairly well. If you don't want to use the 10-second or the 10-second delay on the shutter timer. The downside is that you have to be in front of the camera for it to work. And if it's a really bright sunny day, it doesn't work that well, because the light interferes with the infrared signal, and so you get a hit and miss kind of operation on the camera. And there's no way to lock the exposure, so if you're doing a 10-second or a 20-second or a 2-hour exposure, the wireless remote doesn't do that. It's just a one click and that's it. So you need, for things like astrophotography or long exposure, you need to have a cable remote. And some cameras, like I said, don't have the capability to have a cable remote. Or the remote that's available, the cable remote that's available, is only a clicker. And you can only take the single shot, or you can lock it, at least, for a long exposure. Some of the other remotes that are available have what's called an intervalometer. And what that does is allows you to set either an interval. So if you're doing time-lapse kind of photography, you can set the remote to make a photograph, make an exposure every half a second or every 20 seconds or every 20 minutes or every 999 minutes. Also can shoot multiple images at a time for that duration. Can set a time for the exposure. So there's a lot of other things that you can do with the cable remote that that you can't do with just a simple kind of clicker remote. Video, we talked about that a little bit. What quality video are you looking for or do you need? 720, 1080, or 4K. If you're doing video, do you need accessory audio? Do you need to have an audio out for a microphone or a sound kit? A lot of the microphones on cameras, even the pro cameras, the microphone that is built into the camera isn't all that great. So you need to have an accessory microphone. The memory card slots, that's really convenient if you have two. Back button focus, we talked about. Touch screen. So a lot of cameras now have a touch screen on the back to make adjustments. That can be convenient. For me, I'm not a big fan because they're easy to adjust by accident, either your face when you're making a photograph, or if you're holding the camera, you can make adjustments that you aren't aware of just by touching the back of the screen by accident. The touch screen doesn't work when you're wearing gloves or when the screen or your hands are wet. So they can be convenient. They're not convenient all the time. Optical or electronic viewfinder. Now, most of the mirrorless cameras are all electric, and they have an electronic viewfinder. There are advantages and disadvantages we'll get to in a minute about that. So that's a consideration as far as a feature, whether you want an electronic viewfinder or if you prefer the optical. Voice recording. Some cameras allow you to make a voice recording for the image. So if you can make notes for each photograph that you take. So location information, if you want to record settings or other kinds of notes about that image, people that are included in the image, names and things like that, then some cameras have that feature where you can tag a particular image file with audio. And that comes in really handy if you're traveling and you're wanting to make notes of where this photo is at, what location it's at, what building it's at, what sculpture you're photographing, those kinds of things. It's really nice to have that voice recording feature. So when you get back home, you don't have to match up your written notes with the photograph, because the voice recording will have the same file number as the photograph that you're recording for. Battery capacity. This is a big one for particularly mirrorless cameras that are small format and have smaller batteries, and the battery life is pretty dismal compared to larger format cameras or larger footprint cameras. We're talking 200 to 600 photographs for a small compact camera or mirrorless camera versus up to 1,000 or 2,000 photos for a larger format, a larger footprint camera. Some cameras have face recognition, which helps with focus. If you're doing portraits or if you're doing group pictures, the face recognition tries to make sure that all those faces that it recognizes are in focus. So that helps. Weather sealing, we talked about. Tilt screens are handy, really handy. I wish more cameras had tilt screen capabilities. That allows you to hold the camera at different angles that are otherwise maybe a little uncomfortable. So you can hold the camera up over your head and have the tilt screen pointed down so you can get a view of what you're looking at instead of having to guess. Or if you're doing something that's low down to the ground, like macro photography of flowers, you can tilt the screen up and you don't have to like get down on your belly or crouch down uncomfortably. Or if you're shooting around a corner or something, you can tilt. If the screen tilts to the side, you can shoot sideways. I mean, there are a lot of different things that are really helpful with the tilt screen. We'll get to the DSLR or mirrorless capabilities here in a second. The number of focus points is useful because some of the like consumer and prosumer cameras, they may only have 3 or 9 or 11 focus points. And the focus point is where the camera focuses and also where it prioritizes the light metering. So the more focus points that you have, the more accurate your focus will be and the more accurate your light metering will be. The easier it will be to place a focus point in a part of the frame where your subject is or where your subject is going to be, or where you want the focus to be prioritized. And then also with the light metering, same thing. And then some cameras also have a manual white balance setting. If you're in a lighting situation, particularly it's going to be inside, if you're in a lighting situation where you've got some mixed lighting like halogen and LED and incandescent light, and you've got all kinds of different colors, then the standard white balance settings might not be as accurate. And if there's a manual white balance setting, you can fine tune it to get a better exposure with that lighting condition. That's mostly for people who are really like studio product shooters, maybe wedding shooters to some extent, who are really interested in or required to have accurate color. Okay, the next consideration is camera operation. And this is, again, going to be based on the kinds of photography that you want to do or will be doing most of. The autofocus speed and accuracy is important for sports and action. Autofocus tracking also. Or if you're shooting small children, autofocus tracking comes in real handy when they're running around. Some cameras also have a built-in intervalometer, which I talked about for the cable remote. Allows you to set time-lapse intervals and exposure intervals, those kinds of things. Focus blocking, which is something that mirrorless cameras have, and cameras with electronic viewfinders. It highlights the areas that are in focus, so you can see through the viewfinder the parts of the image that are in focus, so that you can make sure that in a portrait the eyes are sharp, or that the subject that you're shooting is in focus. Shutter lag, we talked about that a little bit too. Shutter lag can be very annoying, and the lower cost cameras tend to have more shutter lag than the higher end prosumer, and definitely the pro cameras have less or no noticeable shutter lag. Viewfinder lag is another irritating thing that occurs with electronic viewfinder cameras, mirrorless in particular, where the signal from the viewfinder either remains in the viewfinder after you take the picture, or there's a delay between the shutter release and the new image in the viewfinder. And that can cause a problem when you're trying to track subjects. Sometimes I rented a mirrorless camera on one of my trips, and I was looking at the same scene. I was photographing the same scene, but what happened was after I made the picture, the setting that was on the camera didn't revert back to a live view in the viewfinder. It was a preview of the previous image, just like you would see on the back of the camera. And a few times I thought I was looking through the camera at the scene when it actually wasn't. I was looking at the previous photo, and so when I made the picture, I wasn't making a picture of that of the scene that I wanted to. It was something that I had already done. So it was kind of frustrating that I wasn't seeing a live image through the viewfinder, and I had to change that setting so it didn't do that. But that was frustrating for a little while. Battery life, talked about that too. Wireless image file transfer. Some cameras allow you to do Wi-Fi or Bluetooth transfer of photos from the camera to another device to store images or transmit images. And that can come in handy if that's the kind of feature that you would need to have. Tethering, the ability to attach your camera to a monitor so that you can see on a larger screen what the camera is recording, or even operate the camera remotely. For commercial photographers, sometimes you have clients standing around the monitor giving you direction or pointers on what they're seeing and what they'd like to see in the image, and that helps a lot with tethering rather than just showing them the back of the camera. Audio and video capabilities, depth of field preview button. That's an interesting feature that allows you to see what the image is going to look like when the aperture stops down from its setting. When you are looking through the cameras and you're composing your image and you're setting your exposure, the aperture on the camera is wide open. When you press the shutter release, then the shutter or the aperture closes down to whatever setting that you've selected. If it's not wide open, the depth of field effect can be previewed by using the depth of field preview button. It'll manually close that aperture down so you can see what's going to be blurry and what's not going to be blurry in the image. With electronic viewfinders, you get a preview in the viewfinder or on the back or on the live view screen of what that looks like. So mirrorless cameras tend to not have that depth of field preview button because you see it already live in the camera. External versus menu controls of common operational features. That's a real big one. If you have a common feature that you're using on the camera, like changing ISO or changing white balance, and you have to dig through a series of menus to get to that function, it's going to take time. It's going to take your attention away from what you're doing, and it's not going to be a very smooth operation. If you have that button, if you have a white balance button on the camera somewhere, or an ISO button on camera somewhere, or you can customize a button on the camera to do a particular function that you use a lot, that makes the process of making a photograph much more enjoyable. If you're always having to dig through a menu to make a change, a common change, that can be really frustrating. And again, it takes away your focus, takes away your attention. It ruins the mood, it ruins the flow. The next one is ergonomics. Basically, how does the camera feel in your hand? Access to controls. When you have it in your hand, does it feel natural? Do your fingers naturally kind of go to the place where you're going to make those adjustments to aperture and shutter speed, the shutter release? Can you get a good grip on the body? Does it feel safe and solid in your hand, that you can hold it steady and not drop it? Is it slippery? Some cameras, the bodies are really, the material that the body is made of, plastic, and the paint, the finish of it, makes the camera fairly slippery. And others have a nice grip that you can get a good grip on it with your hand. How heavy is it? Is it something that you're going to be able to hold steady for a long period of time if you're shooting an event or something like that? And then the size, is it easy to handle, easy to get a good grip on, size-wise? Some people with big hands, with a small camera, it gets a little cramped, and it's difficult to hold in a typical photography stance, and it's difficult to operate the buttons or reach the buttons. And so ergonomics is equally important to the features. If your camera doesn't feel good in your hand, if it doesn't feel like you're going to be able to use it easily, then it's going to be frustrating, and you're going to be more reluctant to use it. Okay, those are some of the questions to ask yourself or to consider when you're looking for a camera or looking for an upgrade. Mirrorless cameras are coming up. They're probably going to be the next generation of digital camera, at least, and their popularity is rising. Now, there are some advantages to mirrorless over DSLR, and there are some disadvantages, and in some cases, those are serious disadvantages so far. So whether you rush out right away and get a mirrorless camera or wait until those DSLR type functions are available on mirrorless is up to you, but these are some of the pros and cons of both. So the pros of the DSLR, they have a larger body, typically, and they're easier to grip and reach controls. The DSLR, having a larger body, has more real estate to add those buttons and dials and other controls that are easily accessible or most often used, and they don't have to go into a menu. The mirrorless camera, the pro for that is that it does have a smaller footprint. It's smaller, it can fit into more things, a pocket or a jacket. It's less conspicuous, but it also has less real estate on the body for those buttons and dials for those common settings. The pro for the DSLR is the larger body is balanced with the attached lenses. So if you have a large lens on a DSLR body, there's a balance point there that makes it easy to hold that camera steady. With a mirrorless camera, the smaller body, the lenses aren't any smaller. The interchangeable lenses aren't any smaller. They're actually in some cases larger than the comparable DSLR lens. So if you put, say, like a telephoto lens, a 70 to 200 millimeter lens on a mirrorless body, it becomes front heavy, and so it's harder to hold that camera steady because you're basically holding a lens, not the camera, whereas with the DSLR, you're holding kind of both of them together. With the DSLR, there's generally no shutter or viewfinder lag. The DSLR, it has an optical viewfinder, which doesn't require electricity for you to see through and make your composition. The mirrorless camera is an electronic viewfinder, and so the battery has to be charged for you to see through the camera. Now, the electronic viewfinder also shows a lot more information than the optical viewfinder. It has the focus blocking. It can show histograms. It can show color shifts. I mean, it can show, there can be a lot of data that can be shown through the electronic viewfinder that the optical viewfinder can't. The DSLR, the autofocus speed is generally excellent. There are two types of focusing, and the one is contrast, works with contrast, and the other one works with comparing one image, basically different views of the same image. And the mirrorless camera, the autofocus it's getting better. They're incorporating some of the DSLR autofocus technology into the mirrorless. The mirrorless is, well, let me go back to the DSLR. The DSLR, the focus system is separate. So it's a separate sensor, basically, from the image sensor. So the focuses separately from recording on the image. The mirrorless focus occurs on the sensor. Because there is no mirror in between, there's no room in there to add a second device or a second sensor in the mirrorless body. So the focus takes place on the sensor. One advantage to the mirrorless is that you can set it to operate silently. So there's no shutter. There's no shutter slap. There's no mirror slap. It's just sometimes not even a click. And sometimes that quiet operation, you don't even know that you've taken a picture because there's no feedback. There's no physical feedback. There's no vibration in the camera like you'd have with a DSLR where the mirror pops up and you feel it and the shutter opens and you feel it. It just happens. It's just electronic. And you can program sometimes the camera to have a sound, and sometimes you can have a shutter release sound to indicate that you've taken a picture. But often in the silent mode, you don't want that noise, but you have to be aware of and practice to know when you've actually made a picture. The downsides to a DSLR is it's a larger body, and it takes up more space. It's heavier. It's conspicuous. When you walk into a room or you walk into an area with a DSLR, everybody knows you're a photographer. That could affect if you're trying to do candid shots and people see your DSLR and your large lens and they become wary of you and they avoid you. Or it can attract attention that you don't want. Some places these days, if you go in with a large camera, they obviously, or not obviously, but naturally assume that you're a professional, and you can get hassled for it. Thieves can see your big camera a mile away. With a mirrorless, a lot of people nowadays are carrying smaller cameras, so you can blend in with all the other tourists. DSLR doesn't have a silent mode. The shutter can be quiet, but it can also be very loud. So if you're shooting things like wildlife, or if you're on like a movie set or something like that, or you're in a quiet place like a church, your shutter release noise on a DSLR is going to be pretty obvious. There's no autofocus on a DSLR in live mode, in live view mode. So if you're shooting video in live view, you have to focus manually. With mirrorless, there is autofocus in live view, so you don't have to worry about changing focus with the mirrorless. What else? On the cons for the DSLR, the image stabilization is in the lens, not the body. Whereas in the mirrorless, the image stabilization is in the body, not the lens. So you can use any lens with a mirrorless camera and get image stabilization, whereas with a DSLR, you would need to buy a lens that had image stabilization built in if you want that feature. Okay, next is looking at the format or the real estate on the cameras. So you can see the smaller camera, the Sony A7 up in the upper left, has a series of buttons on the back, but it's mostly screen. The Canon, the EOS R on the bottom is a mirrorless camera, but it's built on a DSLR body. It's built on the 5D body. And so there's a lot more real estate there for additional buttons for things like white balance settings and preview, zooming in and out, the rear dial to control functions like aperture or shutter speed, some toggling switches, and some other buttons for back button focus and some other image settings. So there's a lot more functionality on the larger mirrorless body. And then on the upper right is the EOS 1 DX, which is a DSLR, not mirrorless, but it's a much larger body. It's got a larger battery that fits on the bottom there. That looks like the bottom looks like a motor drive, but it's also it's the where the battery goes. And there are some other features to it. On the lower right on that camera, there's a series of buttons on the lower corner that mimic the buttons on the upper right. And that includes a shutter release. So you can turn this camera vertically and operate it like as if it was horizontal. So you don't have to twist your arms around to do a vertical shot. Now the EOS R at the bottom also has an extra drive that you can add, which makes the camera a little bit heavier. It adds an extra battery, so it increases the battery life, the shooting life, and then it also has that series of buttons on that battery attachment that allows you to shoot vertically as well. The Sony and the Canon, the EOS R, have touch screen capability on their preview screens. The EOS R and the Sony, those are electronic viewfinders, And the Canon, the 1DX, it's an optical viewfinder. Okay. So there are a lot of considerations when you're shooting with or when you're trying to decide what cameras to upgrade to or what new camera to get. I put this class together, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, probably longer than that, to help people when they're going to buy a camera, that they have a good sense of what they're looking for when they go, and that they're not sold something that they don't need at the camera store, or when they go online, they have an idea of what they're looking for. They're not just looking at features on the specifications under the camera or just the price. So there are a lot of considerations to make, and you can certainly contact me about those questions if you need a little extra help. And I hope this was informative and helped you out. So the next bit is just talking about my workshops that are coming up next year. I have workshops planned for Italy in September. The dates aren't specific yet. I'm still kind of waiting to see what happens with the coronavirus. Then Kyrgyzstan, which is northwest of China, west of Mongolia, in June. And then a series of other workshops, Iceland, Scotland, Oregon coast, California coast. Those are all in progress right now, finalizing dates. The classes that I offer also are working on those to be online, but I have this class. I have a basic camera operation class, photography 1, composition 1, business of photography class, a class on exposure called the exposure equation, which I have a book out regarding that. And all that information is available on my website, which is blueplanetphoto.com. And I have the phone number there as well. And you can feel free to call me and ask me questions, or contact me through the contact sheet or contact form on my website. But all my classes and workshops are listed there as well. So, thank you.